was to cover creating the Unreal Engine scene again, setting up some of those system settings, and then continuing on from last week. So we're going to create the scene, we're going to put a camera in, we're going to enable the movie render queue plugin, and then we're going to hop into Sequencer, which is where we do all of our keys, where we put animation, where we're going to put our camera, where we're going to tell Unreal, this is the camera we need to render from. All of that's contained within Sequencer, so we're going to be jumping into that side of Unreal a little bit more today. And then I just wanted to quickly finish off, hopefully before 10:45, just rendering out at the resolution for Homeworks 3, just rendering out those still frames from Unreal at 1920 by 1080. We'll set up a movie render queue, we'll set up some render settings, and then we'll hit render. And then after that point, I can come around and take a peek and give feedback on your gray box, as well as your 2 moves. Before we get started off, was there anything that anybody wanted me to cover this week particularly, or anything that I should maybe?
Yeah, from the from our assets from Maya, then how do we prepare it for Unreal? Like that's
Sure.
that the one you taught as Sahil, the alignment, the center, if that's important.
Okay, for sure.
Thanks.
You explained how to set up lighting for an exterior scene. Mine's interior, so I was kind of hoping you could touch on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
What did you import? Just I have to.
All right.
First guidelines and direction.
So maybe mine is
Okay, so if
more
everybody
detailed.
just navigates to week 10
Because
on
Because you
FOL.
didn't
If you
import.
don't have a gray box,
This is Unreal Engine,
started,
this is mine.
you can utilize the gray box that's under week 10. So it's already been exported as an FBX file. So you can go ahead and just download that if you don't already have a gray box in Maya.
Sanjay, do you have video recordings from previous classes? Because when I go home, I would like to just study over again.
Yes, I have the video recordings on this computer, but I have to bring them home and do narration over them. So, not at the moment. I don't have them created, but that's something that I will be getting.
Yeah, thank you.
So, for now, what I really want to do is just export this whole scene here. One thing that I will sort of mention is that clipping planes in Maya are set to very, very small values. So if you are building your set to scale, so 1 meter equals 1 meter, you will encounter this issue where in Maya, if we go ahead and click on one of these guys, you should see pretty quickly that we're at ground level, but then as soon as you start to zoom out, you start to get this pretty aggressive clipping plane. So it's pretty straightforward to fix this in Maya. You just go right up here by this here. So if we take a look right up here, we've got the select current camera button here. And what you see, as soon as you click that, it will select the perspective camera, so be your outliner. So then we just go over to the attribute editor. And we're going to be editing the near clip plane as well as the far clip plane here. So all we have to do is set this to a value that's generally speaking above 1. So I'm just going to set it to something like 5. And I'm going to add a few zeros here to the far clip plane.
Mesh combine. Working.
And now, if we zoom in and out, we don't get that really aggressive clipping. So that's something as a workflow point. Again, we're just going to be take a look at the near clip plane, setting it to a value that's above 1, and then adding a few zeros to the far clip plane. Now you should be able to zoom in and out of your scaled gray box without that aggressive flipping. So taking a look at the scene, generally speaking right now, I have this blocked out in Maya. What I need to do is just export this as an FBX. I'm not worried about splitting everything out into separate objects or polygroups at the moment. I just want to get this scene into Unreal as it stands in Maya. So all we have to do that, we just grab all of our objects here in the outliner. So again, just grabbing all of our objects here in the outliner, going up to File, and Export Selection.
So it will export separately?
It will export as one single FBX.
Because I tried it and it was separate. So I combined it.
Okay, like separate in Unreal?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. It's going to come in as its separate polygroups, but when you drag, if you grab all of the different polygroups inside of Unreal from the content browser and drag them into the scene, they'll be in their world space. So we don't necessarily have to group everything here. It will come in with these groups, but that's not necessarily a huge stopper at the moment. It's just about speed of iteration here. So
Sanjay, is it also okay if like select all your assets in Maya and then mesh combine and then export them as FBX?
you can do that. I would prefer, like for myself, having these as separate objects
Okay.
allows us to go in and turn things off if we need to. So if you combine them all, you have one big FBX, and if you need to make adjustments to it, it's a little bit harder to do so. So generally speaking, I tend to keep, especially in the gray box phase, keeping everything as separate objects is usually an easier time for yourself when you're in Unreal. Because then you can double click on any object that you're not super happy with and just delete it out, just to visualize it, without having to come back into Maya and adjusting your set.
But now we have to create the same environment in Unreal Engine with the separate objects.
Yes, like when we export this, when we select our objects in Maya and we export as one FBX, it's going to be one single file. But when we import it into Unreal, it's going to split everything back out into those polygroups.
Okay.
So we'll see that in a minute. So I'm just going to go File, again, Export Selection. And again, I'm just doing an FBX export. Not really changing
Alexandra,
anything.
can you make a screen recording, then maybe you can upload this to Fall?
Sure.
Is it possible? Yeah. Thank you.
Really do for exporting our gray box. So let's go ahead and hop into Unreal super quick. So I'm going to go ahead and launch 5.2.1 here. And I'm just going to create a new project.
Okay. Got it.
Initially load Unreal Engine. It's going to bring up the Unreal project browser. It's going to show you your recent projects here. So we have Class F23. I'm going to go ahead and create a new project just from scratch here. So I'm going to go to Games, and I'm going to go to Blank. So we're not going to grab any of the first person, third person, any of those blueprints. We don't really want too much inside of Unreal Engine project. We just want to use this as a rendering environment. On the right-hand side here, there are a few options for us to take a look at. We're going to leave it as blueprint. C++ is if you're doing a little bit more hardcore coding. But for now, we're just going to leave it as blueprint. Our target platform should be desktop, and our quality preset should be maximum. Starter content, we can leave this on. It's going to create us a bunch of different default particle effects, volumetric effects, et cetera, inside of our project. So if you wanna take a peek at those, leaving starter content on, that will generate those for you. For now, we're gonna leave it on. And we're gonna turn on ray tracing right down here. So it says, choose if real-time ray tracing should be supported in the new project. This is gonna set up a lot of those project settings that we need to go in beforehand to enable. If we go ahead and click on ray tracing, that should enable a lot of those settings. But we're gonna go back in and double check to make sure that all those settings are set when we do create our project. Again, project location, just a general folder, and the project name, you can name it whatever you want. I'm just gonna call this class F23-2, just because it's the second version of this project that I'm creating. And then I'm gonna go ahead and click create. So again, generally when we're inside of Unreal, the major focus point of homework 3 should be getting your cameras into scene, setting up 2 to 3 different cameras in their positions, and then adjusting your environment settings, so your sky atmosphere, adjusting some of your skylight settings, fog, as well as the directional light, to sort of create the same atmosphere from the references that you are going to be gathering over this week and next for homework 3. So that being said, we need to make sure that our Unreal Engine project is set up in the most physically based way possible. So even though we set up ray tracing, we clicked on ray tracing in the project settings, we're going to go right up here to the top right hand corner. And we're going to go ahead, click settings. And we're going to click the second option down here called project settings. So again, that's settings, project settings. I'm going to zoom out here just so we can take a look at the larger window. So as we can see here, we've got a bunch of different headings. The one that we're going to be mainly focused on is the
Render
engine.
settings.
And we're going to be focused on the rendering setting down here. So again, we're going to scroll down to the engine heading. And we're going to take a look at the rendering tab here. A little bit here. So I'm gonna go ahead, just collapse all these categories here. There's a lot of different categories that we're gonna be taking a look at. There's only a few that we need to actually sort of zoom in on though. First one I want to take a look at, virtual textures. So by default, virtual texturing is not enabled. So all we have to do, go ahead and click that on, and that's going to tell Unreal to support UDIMs. So previously, again, we unwrapped all of our assets in the U1 V1 space, just in that one square. UDIMs allow us to take our UV shells and spread them out into the adjacent UV tiles and apply one material to our character while increasing the overall resolution of our character. So rather than applying separate materials, generating a body, an upper body, lower body, arms, having 5 or 6 different materials for our character, UDIMs allow us to create one material, hook up that material one time, and apply that material to our character, and texture the entirety of our character, apart from different material properties that might need a different shading mode. So something that is translucent or subsurface, we might need to create a separate material for those textures. But UDIMs allow us to, again, effectively reduce the amount of materials that we need to run at any given point. So we're gonna go ahead and enable virtual texture support here, as well as a few more of these options that are related to the virtual texturing support. We're going to turn on enable virtual texture anisotropic filtering. And the bottom one, enable virtual textures for opacity masking. So it should be the first two that are clicked on, as well as these bottom two. Virtual texture light maps, more of a legacy feature if we were baking light maps, which we're not, so we don't really need to worry about that. We can go ahead and collapse virtual textures now. The next up, let's take a look at hardware ray tracing. So because we clicked on ray tracing when we were setting up our project, you see support hardware ray tracing is already turned on here. There are a few other options just below it. So if we want to enable ray trace shadows, we need to turn on this setting here, as well as ray trace skylight, so getting us much higher quality bounce lighting or indirect lighting from the skylight, better shadows from the skylight. We need to go ahead and turn that on. As well as texture LOD, this is something that, again, if we were dealing with a larger scene, the hardware ray tracing can determine what LOD of an object for us to load. So we can go ahead and enable that here.
Sorry, what did the texture LOD do? We didn't turn that one on other times.
Okay. It's not necessarily required for us, but basically it allows Unreal to determine which level of detail to load based on what's on screen using a raycast.
Okay.
So rather than like cascade distances, this is going to ray trace a screen and then say this is visible and this is within this distance, so this is the quality of asset that I need to load. It's not necessarily required in our instances. It's something that I am going to turn on because it does help with loading in assets at their highest quality. But when we do render out, there are overrides for the movie render queue that will be forcing the highest LOD regardless. So it's something that in runtime and real-time situations will have more of an effect. In our instance, we're going to be forcing it to the highest LOD regardless, so it's not too much of a. It's something that, again, you might run into if it's not loading the right. See, if you're doing like test render, if it's not loading the right LOD.
Yeah, I already
try
took
on the texture
screenshot.
Can you show me?
through ray tracing.
In what?
Virtual textures. Should I?
Is the enable?
So generate mesh distance fields
Yeah.
that are
And the strip.
software ray
The
tracing
middle
should be
you
enabled.
don't enable. No. Disable this.
Nanite should also
This
be
one.
enabled here.
This one?
Yep.
Let's scroll down here to optimizations. It's the next heading that we're going to take a look at. You can see support compute skin cache is enabled here. So that's all set up for us because we turned on hardware ray tracing at the beginning. And let's just scroll right back up to the top here. Not to mention, we're going to jump into materials. And we're going to enable energy conservation on material. So this is going to just slightly reduce the energy of our indirect lighting. Again, when a photon hits a surface, it's going to lose energy, and that's a physical law. A photon can never have more energy than its first bounce, so it's always going to be losing energy. This helps Unreal calculate that. So again, enable energy conservation on material, and that's just in the materials heading right here in the rendering settings. not least, let's just take a look at Lumen. So we turned on support hardware ray tracing. We had that enabled when we created the project. We turned on some of these additional settings down here. But just taking a look at Lumen, this is the global illumination system inside of Unreal. So we're gonna go ahead and turn on this top setting here, use hardware ray tracing when available. So that's the tooltip says here, uses hardware ray tracing for Lumen features. So when it's supported by the video card, the RHI as well as the operating system. So Windows 10 and up supports ray tracing, and DirectX 12. I think DirectX 11 technically supports ray tracing, but it's not the most optimized. So what we're going to do in a moment is we're going to go take a look at the RHI that we're utilizing in the engine here and make sure that it is on DirectX 12. So what we have to do here, turn on use hardware ray tracing when available. We're going to leave surface cache as surface cache. And we're just going to turn on high quality translucency reflections. We're going to leave detail tracing as detail tracing as well. By default, it should be at detail tracing. If you started your project in another without ray tracing enabled, you'll have to go through and set these up here. But it should be set to detail tracing. What Unreal Engine does, first, I think it's a meter or 10 meters, it does a detail trace on the screen, fills in details where it's needing, additional bounce lighting based on the first 100 meters or 10 meters. First, some distance. I can't remember the exact distance, but after that point, it defaults back to the global distance field. So it drops down to a lower quality representation of your scene. But software ray tracing, you need to have it set to detail tracing so that that first 10 meters or 100 meters are higher quality than the stuff that's in the distance. We don't need it to be rendering, super high quality, 150, 200, 300 meters away from the camera. So detail tracing, surface cache, and then these two settings right here are turned on. Lastly, we're going to scroll down on the right-hand side. We're going to go to platforms. And we're going to click on Windows. And we just need to make sure that we are targeting right here in the targeted RHI section. We're going to make sure that it is DirectX 12. So again, if you create your project with ray tracing enabled, this should already be set up for you. If you didn't, it's easy to come back in. Again, it's just platforms, Windows, Windows machine, and setting it to DirectX 12. So with those settings set up, you can see here that we need to restart Unreal Engine. So it's got to compile some shaders again. So let's go ahead and click restart now. Set up. Those are for the entirety of the project.
Will those okay, so say we change those settings now, would they apply, those changes apply to existing levels we had already set up in the project?
Yes. Yeah, so yeah, they are basically global settings for the current project that you're in. So if you turn on hardware ray tracing, you only need to do that once for the whole project. You can create separate levels inside of that one project and have different test areas if you want. If you're working in one scene, you can, for one level, you can actually duplicate that map file and load it back up, make changes, and then save that as a different map if you want to. But those project settings that we set up are universal for that project. If you create a new project, you'll have to set those settings back up or make sure that those settings are enabled. mention, in regards to interiors, there is only really one difference between lighting interiors and exteriors. You just need to make sure that when you're exporting your interior walls, if they don't have thickness, you need to create a light blocking volume for the outside of your set. So that's the only real consideration. We're still gonna be setting up the directional light as a sunlight, sky atmosphere, skylight, all of that, because that's going to give us the bounce lighting. It's gonna come in through whatever windows you might have, and sort of starts to illuminate the inside. But yeah, you just need to create additional light blocking volumes, just by creating cubes inside of Maya and just populating like the outside of your set with those light blocking volumes. Or making sure that when you're building out your wall sections, if they are, again, if they have thickness, you can apply a two-sided material in Unreal, and that should block the light coming in through the walls. Because Unreal has a hard time blocking light on single planes.
I noticed.
So, yeah, generally speaking, have a little bit of thickness to your walls, so that when it creates its point data version of that mesh, it knows that it has thickness, because it's going to create, yeah, it creates like a representation of whatever mesh you bring in, called a mesh distance field, so it knows the distance between each surface. It knows where there's an object, it knows where there is an object, and it'll basically skip areas that don't have any meshes in them, and skip, like, if a light ray hits an object here, and it knows that it's going to bounce off in this direction, if it knows that there's no meshes in between here and here, it'll just skip the ray to wherever that surface is. So that, again, it has a representation of your mesh, the surface properties of the mesh. So again, if it's a single plane, sometimes that ray will just pass through it, and then that's where you'll get the light leak. If there's thickness, that should cover that.
When they graduate this year. Yeah, that's very big. It's bigger
Almost
than
there.
mine. It's like I don't know, a city.
1,000 more shaders
So
to
many.
apply. I apologize. This is always like the most laborious part of Unreal. It's just like setting up the scene settings. Once you have these set up, you don't really need to touch it again. You can, enable your plugins, like do all that stuff. But it's just this initial setup that always takes.
It gives us time to think the
Yeah,
mistakes,
to
mistakes
adjust
that
it.
we're about. Sanjay, what if, for example, you already set up your scenes in Unreal, put the actors, the lighting, and then suddenly, oh shit, I forgot the settings. Is that the end of the world?
No, you can just go back into those project settings and set them up.
And
at
then
any
it
point.
will reload your scene.
You'll have to do the restart. It'll have to recompile. There's no getting around recompiling
Okay.
if you are turning on settings in there.
Mm.
But at any point, you can go into those project settings and adjust those settings. So even if you didn't set up your project with hardware ray tracing, those settings are there for you to go in and turn them on. So. 10.
So, sorry, because I don't know how many people in the class really have the same situation, but I'm just curious, if I have an interior scene, how important is it that I'm like fleshing out the information behind where the cameras are gonna be?
In what way? Like the outside and exterior? Or-
No, like, say I have one room and I have like half of my wall missing behind where the cameras are gonna be because I'm not showing it through the cameras. Is it important to fill all that in?
Yes, generally speaking, in terms of like illumination, if you have one wall that's completely open, light is gonna spill into there. So if you are going for a more physical lighting style, which again, would depend on your references, generally speaking, having a full set that's 360 degrees, blocking light from all the angles, and then really directing where you want the light to come in, that's usually better practice.
Okay.
Okay. got those scene settings set up, I'm gonna go ahead and just revert my Unreal Engine layout here super quick. So it should be window, and scroll all the way down here. You can load layout and you can also save layout. So if you have a layout of windows with Unreal that, you know, I have two monitors at work. Usually what I have on my vertical monitor is I'll have all of the scene settings, and then on the horizontal monitor I have my sequencer. You can save the layout of windows so that the next time you load Unreal, it'll load back up in that configuration. So you can just pull out all those tabs, set them into the space that you want to set them into, and then use save layout. And that will save, again, the arrangement of windows that you have. For now, I'm gonna go to load layout, and I'm gonna load UE4 classic layout. Again, the only difference between UE5 here and UE4, just UE4 has a few more of those windows docked for us that we tend to use very, very frequently. So it's just a better sort of base layout than the UE5, rather than having to bring up the content browser every time, which tends to get annoying, for at least for myself. Again, it's sort of like having a hidden taskbar in Windows. If you're doing a lot of like application switching, it's just a little bit annoying. So I tend to use UE4, and then I'll grab this place actors window here on the left-hand side. So this place actors window here. This is where we're going to be grabbing all of our actors from. So anything that's inside of the scene is called an actor. But this place actors menu here is also right up here. So that's a change from Unreal Engine 4 to UE5. The place actors now has a spot on the toolbar here. So that's why I don't really mind taking this place actors and either closing it or just collapsing it down for now. Just to give us a little bit of that screen real estate back.
Control N.
So as I mentioned before, we do need to enable the movie render queue
Browse over.
plugin. It isn't enabled by default in Unreal Engine. It's an additional rendering option for offline rendering methods. So this is for us when we get our character in. We're going to be utilizing movie render queue. It plugs directly into the sequencer, which is, again, the sequencer is where we define our timeline. So the sequencer is basically like the Maya timeline. It works like the Premiere timeline. If you're familiar with any of those programs, you can drag your actors in, start adding keyframes to the different properties. All of that happens inside of sequencer. What camera is currently rendering, that's also dictated in sequencer. The movie render queue plugs into that. So we can render out our sequences as an offline render for us to compile as still images in something like Premiere or After Effects. So to enable that, it's a pretty straightforward process. Again, we just go up to Window. Oop, did I lie? I lied. It's Edit. My apologies. Edit and plugins. We're going to get the plugin browser here. A lot of different ones in here. So stuff like Olympic rooms, if we want to enable those, we can do that through here. You know, there's just a lot of different additional plugins that we can choose from. But if we go ahead and type in movie render, version 1.3 is the one that we should be looking at here. So movie render queue, version 1.3. We're not going to add the additional passes, we're just going to add the top movie render queue here. And just to show you, so we go to cinematics here, window and cinematics, you can see we just have those four options. Camera shape previewer, sequencer, take recorder, and takes browser. As soon as we enable this guy, it's going to ask us to restart Unreal here at the bottom of the plugin window. So we're gonna do our last restart of Unreal, hopefully. As it basically configures this plugin for us. This one goes a little bit quicker, which is nice. There we go. Should be all restarted here. And again, just in that plugins window. Show you again. Movie Render Queue is the plugin that we're enabling. Here. So version 1.3 of Movie Render Queue. We're gonna close this. And just taking a look up here at the Windows drop down again, cinematics, that second option should now say Movie Render Queue. So beforehand, we only had those 4 options. As soon as we enable Movie Render Queue, you'll see it pop up. Window, cinematics, should be that second option right here, once it's enabled.
Sanjay is still loading.
Oh, okay, no worries. Let me know when everybody has Unreal restarted.
Still restarting, I mean. This is fast.
Your scene is bigger than mine.
Oh. Shit. Come on, Unreal.
You can do it.
Wait.
Has everybody got it back up? Or is it still compiling shaders? Okay.
Oh, yours is still working.
Aaron is still waiting.
It's okay, Sanjay, you can carry it. I'll just catch up. No problem.
So now I just wanted to cover creating a new screen, a new scene, just from scratch, setting up the lighting,
Yeah.
actors here. So in this default scene here, it's just the open world scene that we're taking a look at. Under this lighting tab, there are a handful of options here, a handful of actors that are utilized to create this current rendering environment. If we take a look at these here, there's really only one actor here missing, and that's the post-process volume. But if you ever need to reference the actors that we need to create a rendering environment, you can always create a new open world and take a look right here in the lighting tab. In the outliner here, I'll just zoom in on this. You can see we have all those actors here. There are a few additional ones in this basic scene that we didn't touch on. That would be the volumetric cloud as well as the sky sphere. But these 4 actors here, directional light, exponential height fog, sky atmosphere, and skylight, these are the 4 most important ones that we need to have light rendering in our environment in a physically based method. Again, these 2, not necessarily required. You can see as we turn them off, not really too much changes. And that sky sphere is not really doing too much. Volumetric clouds are going to slightly adjust the amount of bounce light that we're getting as the directional light casts shadows on these clouds. But for now, again, if you ever need to reference those actors here, the top 4 in the lighting tab are the 4 most important ones that we need, as well as the post-process volume. So let's go ahead and start a new scene from scratch. Just Control N. And I'm gonna open this empty open world here. Again, as I mentioned before, there's no particular difference between empty open world and empty level, apart from the fact that the empty open world has world partition enabled and world data layers enabled. So that's if you're building out a larger scene, you could start plugging in your actors into the world data layers. When you generate a landscape, it would stream in properly. So again, it's just for more open world games. I'm going to utilize this empty open world just to set up our scene. But again, there's nothing inherently wrong with you using empty level. It has an effect if we're, again, building a game, which we're not at this moment. So for now, we're just going to use empty open world. And start that up. You can see here we have a completely black viewport because we don't have any rendering actors in here at the moment. So in the outliner, we've got world data layers as well as our partition mini map here. I'm going to go ahead and shift click both of those.
Shift click.
Yeah. And I'm just going to add them to a folder. And hitting F2 on my keyboard, I can just rename this folder world data. Oops. Go ahead and minimize that.
It is just for organizing, right? Yeah.
Yes, yeah, just for organization. All right, so expanding out this place actors window here. Again, thinking that, Unreal Engine takes the perspective that there's one directional light in your scene, that being the sun. There's the planet that you're on, so we need a sky atmosphere. We need to inject the lighting that's coming from the sky atmosphere. So again, we have direct lighting from the sun, but we also need to inject light into our shadows via the skylight. So again, when we're taking a look at today, particularly because it's sunny, we have direct lighting, which is coming from the sun. It's got that warm 55,000 Kelvin temperature. But if we look at the shadows, again, our eyes are going to adjust and we're going to be color balancing. Automatically, our brains sort of color balance shadows into being black. But if we were coming out of, like an underground parking lot, and we were to see just the indirect lighting scattered from the sky, what we would notice is all of our shadows are blue. If it's a blue sky, if it's a blue, like a cloudless day, we would have a little tint of blue in our shadow. So that's what the skylight actor does for us. And we'll see that in a moment. So let's go ahead and set up a few of those actors that I mentioned. So the first two we're going to add in for now before we import our set. We're just going to add our directional light as well as our sky atmosphere. So let's go ahead and do that. Just by going over to the Place Actors window, search classes, we're going to add a directional light. So just type in direction. You can see here the icon of directional light looks like a sun, so that's how you know that this is your sunlight actor. You go ahead and drag that into your scene. And we shouldn't see a difference quite yet, because again, we have our directional light, but we don't really have anything that the directional light is interacting with at the moment. So we need to add in our sky atmosphere. So as you can see here, sky atmosphere, as soon as we search for it, we have a little icon with the sun as well as an atmosphere just below it. We can drag and drop that into our scene. You can see as soon as I hover over with that actor, click and drag into scene, you can see what all that is doing. So as soon as I drag that skylight actor in, see that I now have a proper atmosphere, as well as I can see the directional light a little bit. So I'm gonna drop that in. Zoom out here a little bit. Let's take a look at what we currently have here. So navigating over to the right-hand side, we have our details panel. The position of the sky atmosphere, because we have the transform mode set to planet, top, and absolute world origin, it means that the placement of this actor does not affect the rendering environment. If we took a look at these other two options here, planet, top, and component transform, then where Unreal considers to be the planet top, or sort of the Earth's crust, would be synced with the world position of this actor here. But as long as we leave the transform mode in its default position, or its default option here, which is planet top and absolute world origin, it means that 000 is basically ground level for us in our Unreal project. So for now, we're just going to leave this as it is. We're just going to center it on our grid, because this, again, doesn't matter where we particularly have this, because of this transform mode option here on the sky atmosphere. Similarly, the directional light, the actual position of this directional light doesn't particularly matter. Again, even if it did, the distances that the directional light is at, it wouldn't really make that big of a difference, because again, we're talking thousands of kilometers, millions of kilometers between the Earth's surface and where that directional light is. So a handful of meters or even a couple kilometers on this directional light won't really have too much of an effect. So we can just center it, and then I'm just gonna drag this up here, just so I have a nice lineup of all of our scene settings. Now, the one thing that does matter with the directional light is its orientation. So if we rotate our directional light, we're actually gonna be rotating the sun around our planet here. So the orientation of the directional light matters. The position of the directional light doesn't matter. So we can move this wherever we want. I'm gonna go ahead right up top here and just turn off angle snaps. So those are all, so we've got grid snap, angle snap, and then scaling snapping right up here in the top right-hand corner of our viewport. And I'm just gonna turn off the angle snap here. If you need different degrees, you can find those here for snapping your angles. If I go ahead and now rotate this skylight, or not skylight, directional light, you can see we're getting a really nice physically based sunset here based on the settings that we have in our sky atmosphere.
Sanjay, how did you enable that control? That
Sorry,
how did the gizmo? How did you enable that?
this gizmo?
Yep.
W, E, and R.
Ah,
So W is move, E is rotate, and R is scaling.
thanks.
So just E on my keyboard, and then just rotate this light around the scene. As a fun visualization, I'm just gonna zoom out of our scene here. And we're gonna go up into, I just set my camera speed to 80, just so I can move the camera quicker than what its default is. I'm just gonna show you what Unreal is doing on the larger scale, why we're setting up the settings the way that we are. So we keep zooming out here. You can see that Unreal is actually generating an atmosphere. It's properly scattering the light as it raises the side of the atmosphere. So when we get that nice sunset look, it's because it's actually passing those rays through the atmosphere, and it's actually passing through more atmosphere, which again, as the light passes through more and more mediums, it starts to lose energy, which is why we have those nice red sunsets on Earth. So as we start to rotate the light, you can see that we're actually getting proper atmospheric effects. So if we come into the sky atmosphere here, got things like ground radius, which is going to affect the size of our planet. By default, it's set to the radius of Earth here. Atmosphere height, again, that's how many kilometers of atmosphere are above the surface. Rayleigh scattering, this is how much particulate is in the upper atmosphere. So Rayleigh scattering. How many of you are familiar with like the wildfires that happened in California and are, I guess, still currently happening? If you've ever seen what San Francisco looked like, if you ever Google what San Francisco looked like during those wildfires, this is basically what Rayleigh scattering is. So it's adding density and adding particles to that upper atmosphere. So we come back to our setting here, we start to increase that Rayleigh scattering. We're not going to really see it particularly from space view. But if I go ahead, hit F on my keyboard here, we're back down to our surface view. If I go ahead and start increasing this Rayleigh scattering, I'm going to bring the sunlight back up here. What you should see is as we start to increase this Rayleigh scattering scale, we're basically increasing the amount of particles in that upper atmosphere. So you start to get that really dystopian orange look to it. So again, depending on what your references are, depending on what sort of mood you're going for, Rayleigh scattering can help us increase the upper atmosphere, increase the thickness of that upper atmosphere. So again, if you're doing a city scene, generally speaking, there are cities in the world where pollution will start to actually cool depending on the landscape. I think in Kazakhstan, there's a couple cities where because of the mountainous regions around it, it ends up being sort of a sink for that pollution. So depending on, again, the larger world that you're trying to sort of imply, you might need to utilize this Rayleigh scattering scale just to thicken up that atmosphere, just to get those colors in the upper atmosphere correct.
Screenshot. Homework number 2, no need to
If Rayleigh scattering was the upper atmosphere particles, me scattering, my scattering is basically lower. So this is closer to ground level ozone layers. So taking a look at the me scattering scale here, we start to increase it. What we're getting is sort of similar to what we would get, close to the ocean if there's a lot of humidity in the air, or ground level ozone. That's what the me scattering scale is. So it's Rayleigh scattering is upper atmosphere. Me scattering is sort of that mid to lower atmosphere. So we need to increase the perception of those light rays.
one by one.
Again, adding thickness to that lower atmosphere here, closer to the
For
ground.
example,
That's what
this one.
me scattering is doing here.
That's the one with the combined. Because I set
This
it.
is the combined.
So I'm gonna set this to something like,
I'm just gonna wait for you.
say 0.05. You can see that we're getting a really nice fall off here. From the upper atmosphere down through to the lower portions closer to ground. But those are the two major settings that sort of control the overall look of our atmosphere. Again, atmosphere height plays a role here too. So again, if we were doing something, say on Mars, Mars has lower gravity, which means it technically has more atmosphere, if I remember correctly, or more kilometers of atmosphere than Earth. So we can start to increase that here. Again, if we had less atmosphere, you can see that it would drop that down and we get more concentration closer to the horizon. As we start to increase it, you'll see those values start to shift there. And again, planet scale has an effect on, ground radius has an effect on our atmosphere as well. So as we start to increase and decrease our ground radius, you can see the curvature of the planet shift off the horizon. So we've got the two basic actors that we need to start rendering light in our scene. So I'm going to take a break here, and what we're going to do is we're going to peel away from dropping in actors into our level, and let's just go ahead and import our set. So in our content browser, this is again where all of our assets live. So whenever we create a material, whenever we create an asset or import an asset into Unreal, it lives in our content browser. So I'm going to go ahead, right click, and add a folder here. So right click, we have our huge menu of assets that we can create here, but we're just going to create a new folder. And I'm going to call this set. I'm going to add a new folder inside of that, and this is just for organizational, for organization. I'm going to call this V1. Here. Double click. And as you can see here right in the middle, it says drop files here, or right click to create content. So we can go ahead, what we're going to do, I'm going to bring up the desktop, and I'm going to grab that gray box set that we had, export it, and I'm just going to drag and drop this directly into the content browser. As soon as you do that, you'll get this
Option box.
asset import menu here. There are a few things that I do want to cover here. We just need to turn on build and animate. And right down here, I want you guys to get familiar with the material section here. When we are bringing in characters and we already have materials set up, we've maybe done a base pass, we brought in our character already, and let's say we're refining our character, we're changing some of the unwraps, but the material IDs and the material names are staying the same. When we re-import it, we can drag and drop it in. We can tell it to search either the local folder, under the parent, under the root, or all assets for materials that are named the same thing as what we have on our FDX. So again, this is something that I want you guys to be familiar with and be comfortable with, knowing that these are where our material settings are when we import. They're not entirely useful at this moment where we're just generating, white materials inside of Unreal. It'll do that by default when we create new materials. But when we are bringing in our character, if we have our materials already set up in Unreal, if we brought in our character and we set those materials up already, if we re-import with a new version of our character, we can tell Unreal, hey, don't create new materials. Look for materials that already have the same naming convention as what's already applied to our mesh. And it will look and apply those materials directly to our character. Again, not super important right now, but just to be mindful that that's where this setting was here, in the materials section, when we're importing our mesh.
Then you just drag.
Again, I'm just gonna tell it to look under locals, and if it doesn't find any materials, I want it to create new materials for us. That's all we're gonna do. Those are the only two settings we really need to take a look at. We're not gonna turn on skeletal mesh because we don't have a rig inside of our gray box, so we can leave that off. So just build Nanite and making sure that we're searching local and creating new materials. If it doesn't find materials, do the same thing. So we go ahead. Right down here, we have two options here. One question that I've gotten in the past, is there a difference between these two? There is. Import, the difference between these two buttons is if we were importing multiple objects or multiple FBXs. If we hit import all, it'll apply these settings to everything that we want to drag in. If we hit import, it'll apply it to whatever the current FBX that's importing, and then it will bring this window back up for the other objects you're bringing in. So if you're importing multiple FBXs and you want to set different settings for those FBXs, import will bring up this dialog box for every FBX. Import all will apply these settings to everything you are dragging in. So at the moment, we're only dragging in one option, so import all and import do the same thing for us. As you can see here, we didn't mesh combine any of our meshes inside of Maya. So you can see here, it's importing 34 of 60. We're gonna get a bunch of different errors here. This is generally okay because again, this is just a gray box. We're gonna be filling this out with assets that we're gonna be maybe grabbing from the asset store. We might be creating new ones. So at the moment, these settings and these normal issues, probably not too much of an issue at the moment. Let's go ahead and close this. And you can see that all of our different objects came in separately.
Sanji, just close, no need to click clear. No need.
No need to clear, you can just close it. So as you can see here, because we didn't combine all of our meshes, we just have these here as separate cubes inside of Maya. They imported as separate objects inside of Unreal. Now this might look a little bit messy, might be a little bit intimidating, but it isn't inherently an issue, because when you export from Maya, the world position of those actors gets baked down. So even though we have all of these separate actors in here, and all these separate objects, if we go ahead and shift click all of our actors here,
Shift click.
and I drag them in,
Oh.
they all come in relation to each other. So all of these actors are zeroed out inside of Unreal. It basically does a freeze transform on those objects when you export. So even though there's separate actors in here, it's easy to just click and drag all of them in. And you can see here, if we come up here and we just zero everything out, all these actors are at 0, 0, 0, but they all have their world space transform baked into their objects.
Is there any reason we call them like I mean this is a bit unrelated, but why do we call them actors?
It's just a naming convention. I actually don't know why they call them actors. I'm assuming it's because they do things and they act upon other things, but I actually genuinely have no idea. Because that was something I had to learn too, was like when people were referring to actors, I was assuming that they were only referring to the characters but no, it's everything that's currently in scene. So sort of like thinking about this as like a film set, like if we have these are all, I guess, actors inside of our scene, inside of our film set.
So anything which interacts with anything is an actor?
Yeah, pretty much anything inside of our scene is an actor. So you can have a blueprint actor, you can have, like here, let me just group these for a second. This is a directional light actor, this is a skylight, or sky atmosphere actor. Again, it's just a naming convention thing, so. It refers to, because we're not dealing with just geometry inside of Unreal, we're dealing with like rendering settings and stuff like that, so it's sort of like a catch-all thing. Okay. One last thing I want to do, just for now, because we don't have a ground plane, I forgot to export a ground plane from Maya. I'm just gonna create a ground plane inside of Unreal very quickly, so just straightforward. Place actors, shapes, and I'm just going to, for now, a plane will do. Actually, let's add a cube. Let's do a cube. Cube, centering that out. There we go. So I just scaled that cube out 150 on the X as well as the Y. You can see just how much additional illumination we're getting from that. All right. So we've got our sea, we've got our directional light, our sky atmosphere here. I'm going to rotate this directional light a little bit just so we can get a little bit more shadow.
So yes, I can just move this now.
There we go. That. So as you can see here, we're getting a lot of really nice bounce lighting. We've got our direct lighting going on down here. But you can see we're getting that really nice warm bounce. So again, light hits the object, it does its first interaction, that's direct lighting, and then everything past that first bounce is considered global illumination or indirect lighting. As I mentioned before, now that we have a set in here, let's take a look at the skylight actor and how that affects our scene. So we have our sky atmosphere, and we also have our directional light. But as mentioned before, when we're dealing with a completely cloudless day, we need to inject light into these shadows. So there is light coming in from the global illumination from the skylight, or from the directional light, or from the sunlight. But we're not getting any of that bounce lighting from the sky. So we need to utilize another actor called the skylight actor to inject those sky values into our shadows. So if we go ahead, type in skylight, right here there's two different ones. There's an AR skylight, which is for augmented reality, so I think it has certain optimizations for augmented reality. But let's go ahead and utilize the second one down here, so just skylight. And you can see, even the icon here, it's got a sky atmosphere, but it also has a light in the center, so you know it's going to be only injecting light from the sky atmosphere. And if we go ahead, click, and drag this in, watch the shadows. So let's take a look here in this shadow region here. Let's see here. So in between the areas of light and shadow, if we go ahead and drag this skylight in, look at the difference between what we're getting before and after. So it isn't isn't something that's like super, super transformative, but it is an additional layer of lighting that adds realism into the scene. Because again, when we have light coming from the sun, it hits the atmosphere, we get direct lighting from the sun, but we also have the scattered light of our sky sphere adding illumination. So we need to drag this in here into our scene. Go ahead and center it. But what you should see is we have a balancing of the color of our shadows now. So where beforehand we were getting really, really orange or really yellow shadows because it's only picking up the global illumination from the direct lighting. As soon as we add in our skylight, take a look at the color of these shadows. They're significantly closer to what we see in real life. So before, no skylight. As soon as we throw that skylight in here, we're injecting a little bit of that blue into our scene. This is a good point to take a look at the mobility of our actors. So all actors inside of Unreal have a mobility. So there's three options that we can choose from. That being static, stationary, as well as movable. Static and movable are pretty straightforward. If it's static, it means it can't move. If you bring in an actor, like let's say you had a light switch, and you built, the light switch itself, and you needed the center toggle to move. If it was set to static, you wouldn't be able to key it. You wouldn't be able to move it. You would need to set it to movable so that Unreal knows that this actor can move. And it's pretty much as straightforward as that. Stationary, we don't tend to utilize too much anymore. So stationary was for actors that are not moving, but can have different properties that change. So it was mostly utilized for lights. When we were baking lights, a static light, all of its contribution, all of its light contribution would be baked into a light map, and it wouldn't be able to change at runtime. So the color of that light, the intensity of the light, that was baked. If you needed to change that, you needed to rebake. Movable lights were the exact opposite. They didn't have any of their contribution baked into light maps. It was only direct lighting, but that lighting actor could change its intensity, its color, everything at runtime. Stationary was a mix of the two. So again, it was something that the point light or the spotlight would remain in its world location. It would be stationary, but its color and its intensity could change. So part of its contribution was
Maybe
baked
because nothing's
while it
graphic,
still
because mine they
emitted
have
direct light.
buildings, so it's
We don't tend to utilize these at the moment anymore. 90% of the time, our lights are going to be probably set to movable. In Lumen, with real-time ray tracing,
so what,
it's in real time. So
I need to
everything
put it up.
can be movable, it's recalculating at runtime. So we don't tend to utilize
light.
mobility as much as we
I will
did
select the light.
beforehand. Where this comes into play now is just particularly with set actors and the rendering pipeline that we have here. So for the skylight, by default, I think it's set to stationary. We can go ahead and set that to movable. And what we need to do is tell Unreal, hey, instead of doing one cube map capture, capture this in real time. So that's the real-time capture option right down here. And if we go ahead and turn that on, we won't see too much of a difference immediately, but if we go ahead and now start to rotate our direction light again, what we should see, if we just take a look, particularly at the color of these shadows here in the background, go ahead and start rotating this light here. Getting a it closer to the horizon. The skylight will update its color as well as its intensity and shadows based on what's currently rendering real-time. So again, we just need to set it to movable and turn on this real-time capture.
Basically above your elements.
The next sector we're going to drop into our scene is the exponential fog. So this allows us to have nice, a better fade into the distance. So we're going to be adding basically a level of ground level particles. So again, we had Rayleigh scattering, which is upper atmosphere, and the density of particles in that upper atmosphere. We have me scattering, or my scattering, which is sort of the mid to lower atmosphere for the sky. Exponential fog is the ground level particles. So again, adding density to the air and adding density to the atmosphere at the lowest levels, that's going to give us some volumetric effects as well. And we're going to see right here that harsh fall off between the sky and our ground plane. That's going to disappear here. So let's go ahead, again, place actors. One nice part about Unreal is that in any menu, you can just start to type and it will search that menu for that option. So let's go ahead and click on place actors. And just, let's start typing exponential height fog. Now there's two different actors here. There's one sort of visual effects and another one sort of under all classes. These two are the same actor. Just more so, this is letting you know if we go back into the overall menu here, it was letting us know that it's considered a visual effect. Here's the exponential height fog. We can also find it under all classes here. So I'm going to type in exponential height fog, click and drag. As you see, as soon as we drop that in, our horizon starts to disappear here. Now, as I mentioned before, with some of the actors, the world position doesn't particularly matter. Things like the directional light, sky atmosphere, as well as the skylight. Doesn't particularly matter where these actors are. That is not true with the exponential height fog. So the X and Y position of the height fog doesn't matter, but the Z position does. So the overall height of the height fog here will dictate how much fog we have. So please zoom out here. We start to lift this up here. You can see right down here, we're getting a lowering of the contrast. Right down here. So again, the position of the exponential height fog, the only thing that matters with the position is the Z value. And if we raise it up, we're basically setting what amounts to like the sea level of the height fog.
Okay.
So this is basically where the transition from
Why should be the one?
whatever 100% density to 0% density is
Says
going to happen.
why should be the height.
So a few settings in the height fog I want you guys to be aware of. Fog density controls the overall density of this fog here. Fog fall off is how sharp the fall off of the fog is. So if we start to increase this, let's just set this to a value that's not contained within the slider. So you can overwrite most sliders inside of Unreal with a value higher than whatever its max is here. So I'm just gonna set this to, let's just say 0.5 for now. So again, the height fog here, the Z position controls where this fall off is happening. So I can start to increase it.
What happened to my
We're submerging our area of fog here. But the other thing I want you guys to keep in mind is the fog height fall off. The lower the value, the more gradual the transition. So we set this to a value of 2, and you can see there's a really sharp transition between 100% fog and 0% fog. If we start to lower this, watch the gradient on this building here. You can see we're getting a much more stretched fall off on that fog. So if you need to, let's say, slightly concentrate the fog at ground level, but still have fog stretching up into the atmosphere, utilize this height fog fall off. And what you're gonna do is stretch the fog up. And then you can utilize the fog density here to pull that back if you need to. As well as utilizing the Z value to control where that fall off is currently happening. And so zooming in here, I'm gonna maybe lower the fog here. Increase the fall off here. You can see as I start to increase the fall off, we're, again, squishing, we're not stretching the fall off of that fog, which means the values closer to ground level are going to start to increase. So again, we're not stretching the fog as much, which means the density is centralized, closer to the ground, so we need to then adjust the fog accordingly here if we want to have much more of a sharp fall off on that fog. Stretch this back out. So I want the fog to sort of stretch up these buildings a little bit more, increase the amount of fog that we're getting here. Another setting,
village.
there's one last setting that we do need to take a look at with the height fog, and that is the volumetric fog option. And it's fairly straightforward. I'm just gonna scroll down here, volumetric fog. We just need to enable it. And what you'll see is that height fog will now pick up atmospheric colors. It'll properly bend, cast shadows from the directional light. So we go ahead and turn on volumetric fog. You can see now we don't get that sort of ugly blue fog. We're getting fog that actually properly picks up the direct lighting color as well as the aggregate color from the skylight. Taking a look at the volumetric fog here as well, I want you guys to be aware of 2 more options, and that's the scattering distribution. So, taking a look at, let's go to our directional light. We've got this option here for volumetric scattering intensity. Again, if we're thinking about how light and particles in the atmosphere interact with light, we need to include volumetric shadows as well. So volumetric scattering intensity We can crank that up for our directional light for now, just for visualization purposes. Make sure that these are all set to static. Sorry, I'm just going into this base material and setting it to two-sided, just to see if that helps with the shadows. Should, hopefully have little shadows here, so again, whatever material you have, inside of the material here, again, we have base color, metallic, specular, roughness, all that good stuff that we're gonna be plugging our maps into. But with the base node here selected, on the right-hand side, we have the option to set this material as two-sided, and that will help Unreal cast shadows properly as well with whatever objects this material is currently applied to. So we just turn that on, and then we just have to apply it here.
Hmm? You just double click on the
Again,
For
with the
example, this
exponential fog, all we have to do
oh,
is turn on volumetric fog,
on the
and the scattering
this one.
distribution
Yeah.
basically tells us in what direction the light scatters. So whether or not we're looking at the sun or have our back towards the sun, which way are we going to see those crisp
Ay, then apply.
light shafts from the sun? So if we have objects casting a shadow,
So
are we
basically
gonna see it
everything.
if we're looking directly
All of
at the sun, or if we're gonna have our back towards the sun, and we're gonna see it sort of coming in. Similar to like, thinking about like churches and things that have, thinking about like, yeah, generally churches, the thing I always think of is like the stained glass windows, but also the alcoves and the different areas that they have light coming into those spaces. They really thought about, especially with Gothic churches, the idea that the walls are mostly glazed. There were supporting structures and flying buttresses to help support the walls, but the main idea was to have a lot of light entering spaces that previously were very, very dark. So thinking about, churches, there were a lot of windows and apertures for that light to flood into. So that's, a location where you get a lot of that crispicular rays or volumetric light rays. The best way to sort of these guys. Other people call them God rays. Again, this sort of volumetric light shaft coming down. Where we're seeing it, the scattering distribution, values above 0 are going to be if you're looking at the light source, and values below 0 are going to be if you have your back towards the light source. So generally, the default value here is what we generally leave it at. So again, weighted, biased slightly towards what we're looking at. So we can leave that as such, but if you can see, if we start to drop this down here, that fog that we're getting sort of falls away. If we view, again, our light source being sort of back here, we turn our camera, you can see that we're getting the scattering on the fog with our back towards the camera. And if we start to increase this, you'll see that effect drop down, and it will be much more pronounced when we're looking at the light source. So keep that in mind. It's something that I want you to be aware of, but you don't necessarily need to change at this point. One thing you do need to be aware of, and you might actually possibly change this at some point, is the albedo. So in the exponential height fog, we've got options to set the fog in scattering color. Leave these as they are. The fog in scattering color is set to black because it's pulling those colors from the sky atmosphere, as well as the directional in scattering color is also black because it's pulling those colors from the sky atmosphere after. So we can leave those black, but if we want to change
Screenshot.
the overall sort of color of whatever the particles in the air are, that would be controlled by the volumetric fog and the albedo. So this is where, if you need to, sort of simulate the idea that there might be grime, it's not gonna be pure white, it might be, pollution, or maybe some sort of other dense fog color, like a gas or something. This is where you would make those changes here. So again, thinking about, much more of like a cityscape, we might have dirt, grime, pollution, ozone, carbon monoxide, all of those things contributing to that volumetric, low-level fog that we have in the scene. So what I can do is I'm just gonna very subtly add a little bit of, just drop that base color down a little bit, add a tiny bit of saturation, but just a little bit of brown into the color of the light to sort of simulate the idea that these particles aren't just water. There might be particulates and other substances in the fog. So just adding a little bit of that color, you can see it's a super, super subtle difference, but you can utilize this to great effect. Again, if you're sort of doing more of like a creepy scene, again, depending on your reference, you might need to adjust this fog value here. You can see it's going to adjust the volumetric fog that's locally in the scene. So again, I'm just gonna add a little bit of that brown tint to it here. So maybe drop the base color down a tiny bit. Lower the amount of fog that we're getting. Alright, last but not least, let's just throw post-process volume in. Again, this is a volume that we utilize to set up our global camera settings for this level. And that's how we're gonna be utilizing the post-process volume. So again, place actors, I'm gonna type in post-process, or just post, got the post-process volume here. We can drag it into scene. I'm gonna search for the first option that we need to take a look at, which is just setting this volume so that it covers the entirety of a level. So we type unbound or infinite extent. Go ahead and switch that on. We won't see too much of a shift. It's not going to change the display of this actor. So even if we turn it on, we can still see that original volume. That's not too much of an issue. As long as this setting is set, this will cover the entirety of our level. So let's go ahead and set some of the camera settings super quick. Just gonna go ahead, click on the gear, collapse all categories. We're gonna go up to the second option, which is lens. Drop that down. And let's first of all take a look at the camera. So if you're familiar with cameras, there are three things that determine the exposure of a frame when we're looking at cameras. Does anybody know offhand what those are? You could just shout it out, I didn't. Okay.
Shutter speed is how fast the aperture clicks, I believe. For like the shutter, I guess. ISO is like the film speed, so like how much like light the film can take before it. It's been a minute since I've done
Yeah, no, no.
it, but
Yeah.
I think does that like explain it well, or should I like try again?
Yeah, no, that's pretty much it. The shutter speed is, it's actually the speed of, how quickly the shutter is opening and closing.
Yeah.
The aperture doesn't open and close. The aperture is,
Like it stays set.
yeah, it's the size of the, aperture blades. It's the hole, the measurement of the hole that light will pass through. And then ISO, like you said, is the sensitivity of the film stock or the sensor. So, let's just go over here, let's look at the,
So you just crazy. Like 300 or over one. Just randomly one.
so taking a look at how cameras generally work, we've got the light that enters our camera, we've got our sensor plate back here. Sometimes the shutter's a little bit more forward than that. And then we have our aperture range. So, as mentioned, the sensor plate, the ISO deals with the sensitivity of the film stock. So usually those are in values of 100, or sorry, 50, 100, 200, 400, 800, it doubles every time. Shutter speed is how quickly or slowly the shutter opens and
I
shuts.
just play a lot.
When we're dealing with film,
They changed something about the shutter.
generally speaking, generally speaking, the shutter speed is always quicker than the frame rate. So we have a frame rate of, we're dealing with film, 24 frames per second. We're gonna set our shutter speed to 1/48th of a second, so basically half the amount of time. And then we have our aperture, and this controls the depth of field. So the wider the aperture, or the more open those blades, the less we have in focus. So thinking about our eyes, thinking about how cameras and eyes work very similarly. If we were to go from this room outside, our pupils would constrict or contract, basically increasing sort of the aperture, so going from like, in here, our pupils might be dilated because we need to allow the light to hit our retinas to see. If we look outside and we look at the sun, our pupils are gonna contract, increasing the aperture, basically going from like, 1.8 to f16. So it's gonna cut down on the amount of light that we're getting hitting our retinas. But what that is basically our eyes automatically adjusting for the exposure of the scene. Because every environment has a level of exposure, or an exposure value. Inside here, we might be looking at an exposure value of maybe 1, 2, 3, because there's not a lot of light bouncing around in the scene. So we need to adjust our camera settings, and our eyes automatically do it, but we need to adjust our camera settings for a darker environment. And the same thing with a brighter environment. A bright environment might have a significantly higher exposure value, because again, there's more light bouncing around the scene, so we need to reduce the amount of light that is hitting the camera sensor at any given point. When we're talking about cameras, we need to also take a look at the exposure triangle. Roll this up here. So when we're dealing with exposure, again, and the exposure is the overall, brightness of our scene, or the overall brightness of our frame. Again, as mentioned, that's controlled by three major factors: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And they all have relationships built into each other. So generally speaking, when we're dealing with film, it's sort of the pick two option. So if you are, again, we're sort of dealing with like an equation. So let's say, particularly with our case, we have a set shutter speed that we're going to be utilizing. And we know that's 1/48th of a second, because that's a 180-degree shutter on 24 frames per second. So we have film, celluloid that's moving through the camera, the celluloid moves up. We know the speed of that film is going to display 24 frames in 1 second. And with old film cameras, they were round shutters. So most DSLRs and current cameras have either, it'll be a sensor shutter, so we'll turn off the sensor and then turn the sensor back on, or it'll be just a vertical shutter. Old film cameras had a rotating shutter, and the shutter speed was 180 degrees. So if the shutter is rotating at the same speed, it was basically a semicircle, which means that the film is being exposed to light for 50% of its frame rate. So as the film moves up, we know it's 24 frames per second. The shutter speed of the shutter is going to be closed. It's going to be closed for 50%, and then it opens up for the other 50% of that frame, and then it shuts again. The film moves up, and then we have a new celluloid. So we have a defined shutter speed, and that's 1/48th of a second, which means that we can utilize the other two controls on here to control our exposure. So we're going to be utilizing ISO, and we're going to be utilizing our aperture, and adjusting those based on the level of exposure in our scene. Once again, aperture deals with the amount of depth of field that we have. If anybody's tried to look at something in a really, really dark room, it's very hard for our eyes to focus on something that's in a dark room, because we have a very wide aperture, our pupils are dilated, which means we don't get a focusing of the light inside of our camera or inside of our eye, which means it's harder for things to stay in focus. So the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field. So as you can see here, taking a look at f1.4, how wide that is open, those light rays aren't going to be focused as much. So more is going to be blurred out. Whereas, taking a look at f8, how small that aperture is, the light's going to pass through the aperture, it's going to be focused, it's going to hit the back of the sensor, but the range that's in focus is significantly greater than f1.4, because as those light rays pass through, they're being channeled and funneled in
This is more
and
content.
focused
And then you can-
onto the back plane of our sensor. So again,
and you can-
the higher the aperture, so f16, the more we have in focus, so the more depth of field that we have, in the sense that it might go from, that we might have 3 or 4 meters intact sharp focus, comparatively to f1.4, where those light rays aren't being squeezed through that aperture. So we might only get, 20 centimeters that's in focus, comparatively to, 4 or 5 or 6 meters. Landscape photographers generally utilize high apertures, or f16, f22, so that they can keep the entire landscape intact sharp focus. Portrait photographers, generally speaking, again, depending on the type of portraiture, if you're doing something that's like, a professional, like a headshot, again, that might be closer to f11, but probably using flashes to increase the level of exposure in their scene. But when we're talking about, art direction, when we're talking about film, sometimes those more open apertures or those lower apertures like f1.4, f1.8, 2, it can be used as a storytelling device. What's in focus, what's not in focus, we consider that when we're watching film, when we're looking at anything. What's in focus is telling the viewer, this is what you need to look at. And then we can use, focus racking to direct the viewer's attention to something that we want them to look at. So that's all controlled via the aperture.
Maybe in this five buttons.
The last thing I want to mention with the exposure triangle is that these values, again, these values are in relation to each other. So if we take a look at the shutter speed, if we go from 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second, that's going to reduce our exposure by a certain value. That value is called a stop. So one stop. If we double our shutter speed, that's one stop darker. So if we look at the aperture, if we go from, let's say we go from 1/30th of a second to 1/60th of a second for the shutter speed, we're darkening our frame and darkening our image. We can do an opposite operation on the aperture to maintain the same level of exposure. So if we double our shutter speed, we know that we can go from f5.6 to f4 and get the same exposure that we had at 1/30th of a second and f5.6. So let's take a look at what that looks like in action. So I'm gonna go ahead, I'm gonna overwrite this ISO value. And I'm gonna override the shutter speed. But as you can see here, we actually can't change these values. And that's because the reason why we can't change these values is because, again, by default, Unreal Engine is a game engine. So what it's doing is setting up our camera for game purposes. When you're running around in an environment, if you're playing like Mirror's Edge or Fortnite or what have you, game designers can't explicitly know what you're looking at any given point. So there needs to be interpolation on the camera. So if you go into a shadowed area or an interior, the game designers need to have that camera basically exposed for the interior spaces. And then when you go outside, it needs to drop that exposure back down because the outside areas are significantly brighter. So if we head on up, we were in the camera settings here. If we head on up to the exposure settings in our post-process volume, the metering mode is what is currently controlling our exposure. So if I take a look in here, there's a mid-gray point value that Unreal is going to say, I need to have this value in my viewport or overall on my screen. If I don't see it, I'm gonna lift those values until that value is visible. So the auto exposure histogram, again, if we go ahead and look, watch how the brightest areas drop into exposure or drop into, again, proper exposure here. So as soon as we rotate that camera, again, we're in a shadowed area here, just in this corner. As soon as we rotate around, you can see that those brightest areas are initially super overexposed, and then they drop their exposure back into something that's viewable. Otherwise, if we were to keep this exposure here and look out here, this would be all blown out. Lower the speed here. If we lower these down here, we look in sort of here, quick pan, you should see these values start to interpolate lower. So we need to turn that off. It's a pretty straightforward process of turning that off inside of Unreal. Auto exposure histogram, we drop this down, set this to manual. And now we have a really dark scene here. That's okay. Because we're gonna utilize our exposure compensation here. Actually, you know what, let's not use the exposure comp yet. As soon as we switch this from medium mode auto exposure, you'll see those camera settings will now be something that we can edit. So we need to set the metering mode to manual. And then we can type in our values for the shutter speed. So 48. And I'm gonna leave the ISO of this to 100 for now. But when we're dealing with in-engine cameras, ostensibly the ISO is our exposure comp. So the exposure compensation and the ISO are basically doing the same thing in Unreal. In real life, ISO, if you start to increase that ISO, you start to introduce noise. So the more current that you're running through the sensor, the more electrical noise that tends to add. So the higher ISO you get, the more noise you tend to have in your image. Same thing with film stock. The higher ISO, the more grainy the image tends to be, just because it's more sensitive to light. But when we're dealing with sort of non-physical values in terms of, you know, the directional light here, we're dealing with intensities that are significantly lower than what the sun is actually putting out. We can override this value here in the directional light. We can set this to 120,000 lux. And now we're gonna be getting an exposure that's very similar to what we would see in real life. Again, this is the amount of light that's hitting the Earth's surface at any given time. It's around 120 to 150,000 lux. So you can see here, as soon as we brought that up to the correct intensity, our scene is now properly exposed. Because we're applying physical camera values to our viewport. So we can utilize this intensity, and we can scale it down. Unreal sometimes has a little bit of artifacting when you tend to utilize full values like this, stuff that's similar to, you know, 60-watt light bulbs or 800 lumen light bulbs. Those are okay, but when you're dealing with like very high levels of energy, like 120,000 lux, you tend to introduce artifacting, so we can scale this down a little bit. We can remove the 0 here. You'll see our exposure will shift. We can come back to our post-process volume and then just adjust this exposure compensation as a flat value. So again, it's sort of like solving an equation. If we're reducing one value, we need to scale something else up to maintain the overall level of exposure. So again, if we set it to 10, that's going to be quite a bit. Let's set it to, I think it was about 3. 3 is the, this helps here, to get us back to that, the look of 120,000 lux. And we can leave this
What is this?
as it is.
So
So
then-
once we set that exposure
Diagram.
compensation,
Diagram.
then
Here.
all of our values here are going to be scaled in relation to that. So it's sort of like an overall scale on all of our cameras, because we're not utilizing full exposure, like full sunlight values. We're gonna use a scaled down version of it. So we need to compensate our exposure. But once we've set up that exposure compensation, we can utilize the camera settings just as we would in real life. So let's go ahead and do that by setting up our sequencer. We'll just run through setting up the sequencer. I'm gonna run through setting up a couple cameras. Hopefully we can get this done in about 15-20 minutes. Then the rest of the class will just be me coming around. I know I've gone a little bit over, I apologize. But I just wanted to go through a lot of these settings, sort of explain why we're doing the things that we're doing.
Mine is
Sir,
over.
can you just show where you did the exposure compensation again?
Absolutely. So it's just under lens. It's in the post-process volume here. Lens, exposure. I set the metering mode to manual. And I set the exposure compensation to 3. As well, I've set the ISO and the shutter speed for every camera coming into the scene to 48 and 100 at the moment. Alright, so let's get into the fun bit. Let's go ahead and create a sequencer, or a master sequence for us. So again, this is similar to the timeline in Premiere or After Effects, or any of those sort of timeline-based programs. So right up top here, we've got our place actors. We've got one for our blueprints, and then this is where our master sequences are going to be held. We drop this down. We've got add level sequence, which is basically an empty cutscene, as well as add level sequence with shots, which is an empty cutscene, but it has those shots made up for us. So again, we're thinking, let's say we were sort of directing like a short intro sequence. We would want to add level sequence with shots. Maybe we know it's 3 or 4 shots. We can set up those shots inside of the master sequence setup before we need to make those manually. So the only difference between these two options, this one's going to create the shot tracks for us. This one is not going to create any shot tracks. So show you what that looks like. Add level sequence here. I'm just going to create the empty one real quick. I'm just going to call this new level sequence, and I'm going to add a
Sanjay, sorry, did you click add level sequence or add level sequence with shots?
Right now, I'm just showing you what add level sequence looks like, and then
Okay.
I'm going to get you guys to add level sequence with shots.
Sorry, my apologies.
No, it's okay. So once we make the folder for our level sequence, you can see here, we're into our new level sequence. This is where all of our shots are gonna go in this main timeline here. And the actors that are associated with them are gonna be populated on this left pane here. So this is what an empty level sequence looks like. We've got our frame, our playhead, we've got our in and outs here. So the red and green are where the sequence starts and ends. If we maximize this, we also have our frame rate right up top. So we're gonna set this to 24 FPS. You'll see those frame numbers change. Generally, this is our timeline here. So the difference between just creating a level sequence and let's go ahead, add level sequence of shots. We're gonna get a different menu upon clicking level sequence of shots. And the most important thing that we're gonna look at is just number of shots. So every time we have a camera, every time we have an actor moving, we need to add keyframes to them. Best practice, we put all of the action and all of the keys that we want keyed inside of a shot. So let's take a look at what that looks like right now. I'm gonna set the number of shots to 2, just so I have 1, 2. I don't need 5 at the moment. And I'm gonna create level sequence with shots. So you can see your same interface, but now it's created these 2 shots for us. Again, shots, we need to have shots inside of our level sequence to tell Unreal what camera to render. So if we didn't have any of these shots, we didn't have a camera cut track, Unreal, and we went to render the sequence, Unreal wouldn't render anything. It would load the sequence, it would load the keyframes, it would play the animation and the keyframes, but it wouldn't know what camera to render from. So we need to make sure, again, we have our shots here. We can click on the shots, we can write them down.
You can watch it.
These will still play totally fine. They'll play back to back here.
What are you doing when you pull that down? Like, what difference does that make?
It's for organization.
Uh,
So it's just, it's really hard once you start to get into larger cinematics
Question.
inside of Unreal. You might
How
have
did you cut before
10,
you put it?
15 different shots for one cinematic. So being able to see them separated just on different levels, it's a lot easier to see where one shot ends and another begins. So it's more of a workflow thing, rather than like an actual implementation. There's no particular difference in the way Unreal reads it, but it helps us separate these tracks out. So we know, okay, this is shot 1, this is shot 2. Let's go ahead and add another shot here, just so you know we can go through the process of adding a shot. Pretty straightforward. On any of these shot sequences or shot tracks here, you can click the plus shot button. You'll get a list of previously created shots. But if we go insert shot, save asset as, we're gonna create a new folder here. We're gonna call it shot 30. You can see I have the name already populated there. And save.
Sorry, what did you click to add the shot?
Oh, just plus shot.
Oh.
And then insert shot at the top.
flash shot and then insert shot.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And then we get into the save assets folder.
Sanjay, how did you reduce the length of the upper film? How did you reduce its length?
Sorry?
The upper film, yeah,
This one?
the length. Okay, sorry, you just moved me.
Oh, yes, sorry, I should mention that. To navigate in this sequencer, the major shortcut is holding right mouse button. What you can cross. Control and scroll wheel will zoom in and out. So right mouse button to scrub or to pan the timeline. Control, scroll wheel will zoom the timeline. And then you can use the greater than and less than or the period and comma keys to snap between edges of shots. So I'm just using period and comma right now. I'm just snapping the playhead. So it'll snap to the end of one shot, it'll snap to the beginning of the next, it'll snap to the end here. And that also works for when we start to add keyframes in there as well. So let's go ahead and let's delete shot 20. And let's just take a look at shot 30 and 10. Now, even though we deleted shot 20, keep in mind, these shots, if I right click on them, go to properties, and navigate down here where it says subsequence, and I browse to, I want you guys to be aware that these shots and the things that are contained within the shots are separate actors. So these are all referenced in. So it's similar to Maya if you're referencing in an FBX. That's the way the sequencer works. So even though we have our master sequence and we have shots inside of this master sequence, we can create a new sequence and drag those same shots into a new sequence and have the same actions as long as everything that we need is contained within the shot. So I can load, again, I can load just shot 10 if I wanted to. I can also load sequence root or our master sequence with all of our shots in it. So again, if you were planning out or storyboarding something, you can block out your cameras in Maya, or block out your set in Maya, bring it into Unreal, place in some cameras, and put them into their subsequent shots. So breaking it down based on action, based on where a camera cut might happen. If you're doing dialogue A and B, every time the camera switches, create a new shot, paste the camera in from a previous shot, or create a new camera. But as long as you have those actors and the cameras, everything inside of these shots, they can be referenced into a new master sequence. So again, our shots are sort of like our media tracks. If we had pre-recorded video and bringing that into like Premiere or After Effects, our master sequence here works very similarly to the master sequence or the master timeline in Premiere, where you import media files, import pre-made media, and then you are sequencing it inside of this master sequence. It's the exact same workflow inside of Unreal. You can have your master sequence, or sequence root is what it's called right now. You have your shots, but inside of the shots here, we have our camera cut to tell Unreal this is the camera to render. And we have a camera that it's rendering right here. So I'm gonna go ahead and dock this here real quick. I'm going to block in some camera moves really quickly here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to preview the camera. So I want to see the camera in my viewport here. So I'm going to click on this little icon of a camera, and that's going to lock our viewports to the camera. If I lock it to the camera cut, I can't make any edits to the camera. So the camera cut is solely for viewing what's currently going to be rendering out. If we preview the camera itself, this is where we can make changes. So you can see here, if I hold right mouse button, I can wiggle the camera around. If I turn on auto key, which is maybe a little bit hard to see here, but this key with inside of the rhombus or diamond. If I turn that on, I have to wiggle my camera. I won't do it because I don't have the keys set previously, so let me set one key here, scrub the timeline, I can wiggle the camera, and you can see it's going to create that key for us based on where I'm putting the camera here. So if I put the camera here, navigate back down, I can adjust where this camera is moving to, fly that back a little bit. Here, you can drag this keyframe out. Now if I watch this back, I have some basic camera animation here. was with the shot that was already created. So that was with shot 10, something that had a camera cut track, something that had a camera already linked to it. So let's say you create a new shot. Let's say you need to start a shot from scratch. Well, we've already gone through the process of, add shot, insert shot. We've got shot 30 here. So let's go ahead, we can jump into it just by double clicking the shot. You can see we're missing a lot of the things that we need inside of our shots for Unreal to render from. So the first thing we need to do is go ahead, click at this plus track button. We need to add a camera cut track. So plus track, camera cut. You can see that's added the camera cut track down here. And now we need to associate a camera with this track. So if we go ahead, hit plus camera, we can go new binding. And we can select a camera that's maybe already currently in scene. So we have this Cine camera actor that's already spawned in here. But you can see that's because I had the playhead on the other shot, because there are actors in that shot that are being spawned in specifically for that shot. So if we have the actor or the playhead here in our shot, we go to plus camera, new binding, we don't have any cameras in our scene. So what we need to do, go up to, again, the place actors window. And we're gonna be utilizing the Cine camera actor. There is camera actors in here, just a basic one. That's mostly for video games. It lacks a lot of the physical camera settings that we're looking for. The only settings that this camera actor has is field of view. So we're gonna utilize Cine camera, and that's gonna have aperture, ISO, shutter speed, all of that good stuff. So once we click it, we have the actor in our scene. Now, let's rename this to Cam 30. So I just renamed this actor here, Cam 30. Now I can go plus camera, new binding. And you can see here, I have camera 30 to choose from. And as soon as I add it in to the camera cut track, you will have a camera cut track here. And it's a little bit hard to see because of the thumbnail preview. But right in the top left-hand corner is the name of the camera that this track is currently assigned to, or bound to. So if you're ever curious what camera is currently assigned to the track, or in this sequence or in this shot, it's stored right up here in the top left-hand corner of that track. Alternatively, you can right-click on the track, and the bottom option here will allow you to select whatever camera is bound. So as I mentioned before, there is a difference between these two options here. So if we are locking the camera to the camera cut, it means the camera cut, again, functions basically as an operator for Unreal. It tells Unreal, at this frame, render this camera. So if we're previewing the camera cut, that's all we can do with it. We can't edit the orientation of the cameras. We can't fly around and set keyframes. So keep that in mind. If you just want to view your shot back without the threat of changing any of your camera keyframes, view the camera cut. If you do want to add additional keyframes and change the animation of your camera, lock your camera to the shot cam, like so, and we should be able to move our camera around. So again, camera cut, I'm trying to move it here. I can't move my camera if I lock it to the actual camera here. You'll also see in the top left-hand corner, it says pilot, actor, cam, 30. That means that you basically assume direct control, and now you can move it around like an FPS cam. Holding right mouse button in WASD, Q and B will raise and lower it as well.
So why is it that camera cuts would be different from the cam O3O?
So again, the camera cut, when Unreal renders a sequence, it loads the master sequence, and then it loads the shots contained within that master sequence, and then it reads the data that's contained within the shots. So if we can add as many cameras as we want to each shot, but at any given point, Unreal can only render from one camera. So the camera cut tells Unreal, don't render, the game cam, don't render a player cam, don't render anything else but this camera at this frame. So it just tells it, this is the camera that I want you to render. That's basically what the camera cut is using. Again, because we're breaking down our scenes based on when the camera itself cuts, so again, if we're doing dialogue back and forth, let's say we had, A, B, back, like it was like A1, B1, A2, B2, A3, B3. You would have those as individual shots in the master sequence. So you wouldn't have one shot with, like, here, it might be a little bit easier to sort of showcase this.
I think I know what you're saying, but
Yeah.
when I look at my cam O3O and my camera cuts, those are different shots. So camera cuts is getting some information from somewhere else.
Okay, I'll come around and take a look at what you have
Okay.
and see. Sorry. I'm trying to find where I am in the scene. This. Okay. Okay, so let's say I had two of these cameras here. So I just duplicated that just with Control D. I'm gonna add actor to sequencer, and I'm just gonna add that new camera in here. Alternatively, I can just drag and drop any actor from the outliner directly into sequencer. So now that I've added this cam one here, you can see this camera cut track. I can adjust it. So for the length of the shot, but let's say I only wanted it to be in this one camera up until frame 30. I can duplicate this shot out here just by holding Alt and left click and dragging. I'll duplicate the shot there, the camera cut. And then I can rebind it to a different camera. So let's move this camera to a different place. So let's move this one to here. It'll be a little bit hard to see, but I just moved this camera 31 to a different location. So if I'm previewing the camera, I'm just previewing that camera. Right? If I preview the camera cut, because I have two camera cuts here, cam 30 and cam 31, if I preview the camera cut, this is what Unreal would
Close
render
with the
out.
camera.
So you can see that I now have the cameras switching inside of the one shot.
Maybe later I will.
Generally speaking, we don't tend to do multiple camera moves in one shot. If I wanted to keep, camera 31, have it cut to camera 31, I wouldn't do it in this one shot.
Just to
I would delete this camera cut.
bring the video.
I would say, stay in camera 30 for the rest of this shot.
Yes, I did it in Unreal.
But what I would do
Shut up, that's it, homework.
is I would insert a new shot. I would say, you know, maybe this is shot 40. So I just created a new shot. I'm gonna go through the same process, adding camera cut,
Okay, we'll do it.
and I'm gonna rebind camera 34 to this. I'm gonna track the transform. So all the properties on an actor that we can key, they're contained under the track.
But big
So-
improvement from last week.
We've got
This is just the 3 keys.
all of our different options here. In the details panel, if you see this icon here, right here, it means that this key can be, or this property can be keyed. So as soon as you hit this button, it's going to create a key for this property here. If you're ever missing the transform, it's pretty straightforward. You just go plus track, and then add the transform here. And now we have the transform, and this is where you set your transform keys. So unfortunately, we can't key our transforms here. We can only key the scale from the outliner. However, in the sequencer, we can actually key the transform just by clicking this little plus. So again, if we had multiple cameras and multiple shots, which you will have for homework 3, this is what I'm expecting. Set up one scene like this. You have your sequences. You've got 2 cameras here. So if I scrub through your timeline, you should have shot 30, shot 40. And if we scrub over to the next shot, it splits it up based on camera. So it should be 1 camera per shot, and then whenever we cut, we need to create a new shot. So this is where I would want you to start off for homework 3. Get your scene set up, get your camera set up, get your sequencer set up, and then a good 60 to 70% of the assignment is basically done at this point. All we have to do now, I'm gonna save the scene. We're gonna say lighting scenario 1. So I've saved lighting scenario 1. I'm gonna pop out a camera. Let's go ahead and adjust some of these scene settings here. Let's do something like this. Let's, adjust this here. Maybe we want the sun sort of maybe coming through the buildings a little bit. Maybe it's more of a daytime scene here. Now, once we have this set up here, we're going to change these settings. All we have to do, change the fog just so we know it's sort of a different scene. I go File, Save Current Level As, and then just save this as Lighting Scenario 2. And now you have your 2 moods. So you have 1 level for lighting scenario 1. You have a 2nd level for lighting scenario 2. And in both, we can load the same sequencer. And because again, the geometry, the position of actors, everything is the same between the 2. All we need to do now is render this out. go ahead and do that. Super quick.
Sorry, how do you load the same sequencer, or is it automatic?
It should be in the level, so if I go scenario 1, and load the sequencer here. It'll be fine to render out from here. One thing you will have to do in your second scenario is even if you load the sequencer, so again, it should be contained here because in our world outliner here, we've got the new level sequence as well as the sequence root. So they're both contained up here. You can see lighting scenario 2 is the level, and then the sequences that we have are contained up here. So we just load them up. There are two things that we need to do. Just when we re-render, because this sequence is bound to another level, we just need to fix the references, which is a really, really straightforward process. We hit the wrench, advance, and then fix actor references. And that's all we need to do. So again, when we load into sequence 2, or load into level 2 for our lighting setup, we can load the same sequencer, but we need to rebind these assets. So if we ever see it with a red icon here, it means that maybe something you brought over has just been decoupled from its reference inside of the sequencer. So we just go to the wrench, advance, rebind accessible references, or sorry, fix actor references. And as long as you have an actor with the same name, it will find that actor and rebind it for you. So again, shot 40, found object is missing, advanced, so again the wrench, advanced, fix actor references, and we should be able to scrub through this. Now we'll need to adjust the exposure of this camera because again, we were bringing in the exposure from the previous scene, which is a lot darker. So if we want to key any of the camera settings, we can select our camera. I'm just going to key the current aperture. So this is under current camera settings. And it's just under current aperture here. I'm gonna go ahead and key it. You can see it pops up in our sequencer here. So this is something like 8, maybe 60. And now we're bringing this camera back into the proper exposure. Any track that we have, I would say set up your camera, set up your exposure for your first scene. For your second scene, key these settings that you want. So aperture, we can key, we again scroll down here, post-process, we can go to lens, go to camera. We can override the ISO for our camera here as well. This is ignoring the post-process volume, so you can set this locally on each actor. But what we can do, save the sequence. I'm going to load back into lighting scenario 1. Load the same sequence here. Rebind. Again, 6 actor references. Again, 6 actor references. And then once we're in that original sequence, if we need to ever re-render it, we can right-click and mute this track. So again, in the sequencer, any track that's keyed, again, I would say set up your cameras for sequence 1. When you're going to lighting scenario 2, in your separate level, you know, you save your level, it should have all the same actors, name the same thing, key the exposure settings, and then if you ever need to come back to sequence 1 and some lighting scenario 1, all you have to do is mute these settings, and it will default back to the original settings that were for that camera. So again, so preview this camera here, make sure I have game settings on. This is what Unreal would render out. So I know I'm running a little bit short on time here. Let's just cover rendering really quickly. It's really straightforward. Right up here, we've got the clapper. Right here, so render this movie to video or image frame sequence. Go ahead and load that. And as long as we're in our sequence root, what we should see is this is our movie render queue. We've got our sequence root, and because right now we're currently in shot 40, what it's done for us is actually disabled shot 30, so it's not going to render out shot 30 for us. So we just need to enable that again if we want to render out shot 30. Alternatively, if we were in our master sequence here and we hit this button here, it would turn on every sequence that's contained within, or every shot contained within the sequence. On the right-hand side of the movie render pipeline, we've got our sequence that it's rendering. So again, it's the sequence root. If we wanted to render out a different sequence, we could do that. And the associated level. So from here, if we want to change the level that we're rendering out from, we can do it from here. Right now, because we're utilizing the same reference shots, this is not going to work for us. So whatever the current level that you're in, stay in that level. Then when you load scenario 2, fix your actor references, fix your exposure, and then re-render. But what you'll see is this map will be shifted to scenario 2. Again, the shots that are rendering out are contained here under the sequence because we're rendering out the master sequence.
No worries.
Let's take a look at the settings real quick. By default, should be 1920 by 1080. And we're not going to enable any other settings, but what we are going to do is we're just going to change the output directory. And we're just going to set it to just a random folder on our computer. We can go ahead and hit accept. And by default, you can see that our frame rate should be set correctly here. Actually, it's not. So let's go ahead and set our frame rate on our sequence to 24 FPS. And right up there. And now all we have to do is hit render local. Give it a second to warm up here. So we get a render preview, which is really nice. You can see on the right hand side, cut, the camera, as well as out of how many shots we're rendering. We've got the frame count. We also have engine warm-up frames. If we needed to warm up particle effects, we can add in render warm-up frames to get those particle effects emitting before we start to render. We also have on the left-hand side the current sequence, the total frames of that sequence that it's rendering out, as well as what current state the pipeline is here. So you can see through here, it's rendering out shot 30. Now it's rendering out shot 40 here. We're gonna have 120 frames of this. I'm only looking for 2 of them. So that's lighting scenario one, pretty much covered. So let's take a look at what we have coming out of Unreal. Lighting scenario one, this would be your first image. Again, this would be your second image. Again, if you wanted to adjust the exposure of the shot, you can do so. That's all we're gonna do for, oops, this one. I'm gonna go ahead and load lighting scenario two. I'm not gonna save any of these. Don't save. I'm gonna load sequence root. I'm gonna rebind my actors again. So advanced, fixed actor references. Again, advanced fixed actor references. And preview the camera, we can see here, definitely, this is in good exposure here. Because I've keyed the aperture for this shot. So I'm gonna need to do the same for this camera. For shot 30. So I'm gonna go camera component. And then I'm going to add in current aperture. And that's basically the same as clicking on the camera and keying the current aperture. It just tells us what component those settings are stored under. And we can go ahead and change this value to something like 16. Maybe let's do F8. Key it. Again, I'm gonna pop out of the sequence root, get the movie render queue. See here, it's still bound to lighting scenario one. So let's go ahead and set this to lighting scenario two.
Just like that. You go out, it's your fault. We don't.
Again, we're running out these two cameras.
If they say, oh, so we don't pay, we give
I'm gonna change the folder,
That's not our problem. Goodbye.
just so I'm not overwriting, the frames that we rendered first. We can go ahead and hit render on this guy.
2 hours and 15 minutes.
Do you have that memory?
Hmm?
Do you have that memory?
No, I will edit it.
Now we have our two lighting scenarios. So lighting scenario one might be super exposed. We might need to adjust the exposure on those shots. But what we should have is the same camera angle.
Got it.
That's why we are utilizing the same sequence. Alternatively, what we could do as well
Photoshop filter with guidance.
is locate this sequence in here.
Send them the all of this.
And even if I duplicate the sequence, as I mentioned before, these shots in here, they're referenced in. So even if I duplicate the master sequence, I'm not changing the shots that are contained within them. So for me to have a duplicate of these, duplicates of these shots, I need to actually duplicate shot 30 and shot 40. If I wanted to, have two sets of shots, we already have those cameras keyed inside of them with aperture, all that good stuff. I can just duplicate them, come back to our sequencer, and then sequence root one, which is our copy. I can right click, and I can just swap out the shots here as well.
This chat. This is Photoshop. It looks this is Photoshop. It's very unreal.
that generally makes sense. I know it's a lot to sort of handle in terms of like rendering. Hopefully the rendering section won't be too hard. I will be recording the movie render queue as well as the sequencer setup, because I know it's a lot of like
Yeah.
intricate things. This should get a little bit clearer next semester as well, when you are setting up your characters with animation. Just jumping into this, we're gonna be setting up, like, we're starting with the basic building blocks of shots and sequences right now, so that when we do get to, you know, animating your characters, bringing in your rig, the camera portion and how the sequencer itself works should be pretty straightforward, and then it's just worrying about, okay, is your animation coming in properly? Is it in the right location in the world space? And then is it playing back right? But once you have the sequence basics in, it's pretty straightforward from there. Again, shots, you have your master sequence, then you have shots inside of that master sequence, and those shots are referenced in to the master sequence. So if you load a shot apart from the master sequence, and you change things in that shot, so you can see here I'm in sequence route 1. If I go into here, I've got like a breadcrumb trail of where I'm in currently. So if I ever want to go back to the master sequence, I click on sequence route. But if I'm in shot 40, let's say I navigate, you know, right click on this shot, I go to this shot and I load this up. You can see I'm not inside of the master sequence, but any change that I make here will reflect, because again, this shot, this shot actor, or this level sequence actor is referenced into the master sequence. So keep that in mind, that when you are going in between your levels, you're fixing your actor references when you go into your new level, but you need to key your exposure for each lighting scenario. So that's why I suggest set up your mood 1, finalize mood 1, get it to a point where you're happy with it, set up your cameras, and then you can either utilize the same sequence with those cameras in them, and then rebind those actors, or you can create a new level sequence for lighting scenario 2, and then copy and paste, like create separate shots, copy and paste the cameras in, and because, again, the world geometry is the same, your world space keys will all be the same. So if you copy a camera from one level sequence into another level sequence, that's totally fine. If you don't want to do the rebinding of the camera actors. It's just a workflow thing. I find it pretty quick to just, you know, click on it. As long as that actor's in the outliner and it has the same name, it should find it no problem. Rebind it for you. But again, alternatively, we can go in, you know, create a new level sequence of shots, create 2 shots for this.
They start clicking into jobs. They start fighting all the way. It's
Right,
honestly better than
created a new level sequence. I can load the original one back in here. I can set a transform key.
Very top of the line. You need
Transform,
experience
key it. I can grab these, I can copy it. I can go to sequence route 2. I can delete this spawned actor in, paste this actor here, and then right clicking on this camera cut. If you have a camera cut that says object binding missing, bound object missing, you can right click here, properties, camera binding ID is where you rebind your camera to the sequence. And then we can just rebind it here. Good to go. So again, it's a little bit flexible. Play around, set up your cameras, get into creating these shots and sequences. I might, you know, I'll probably end up pushing this back another few days just so that next week we can really just focus on like, having next week be feedback. I can address any issues in class. I think think I already have it due on the 22nd, so I think it's due at 8 p.m. on the 22nd. So next week, again, just as a catch-all concern, class, next week, have your shots set up, have your environment in Unreal, bring your Unreal project to class, or bring your shots to class, and then I can give you feedback on where I think you can improve. But again, have reference for your two moods, and you're trying to utilize fog, local volumes, as well as spotlights, and some of these basic lights in here to sort of fill out your scene with atmospheres and light. Does that generally make sense?
Yes.
Sanjay, we got lost with the camera cuts, but next week we're gonna.
Yes.
It was like, but it was a big improvement from last week. We already understood everything, just like rendering setting up the camera sequencer. We keep on
Yeah.
yeah.
That's why I don't mind going over this multiple times because this is the basis.
Sanjay, you mentioned you're gonna like put on video
Yeah,
on the
my
hopefully before the assignment deadline,
Yeah.
so that we can.
Yeah, my goal is to have it up before the assignment deadline is.
Yes, thanks.
But yeah, it's just been a bit of a busy week. So.
No, I mean the settings for the directional light. Sanjay, a while ago, sorry, directional light, you changed something about the cast shadows, something like that.
Yes, so.
Can you show it again, please?
For
I
sure,
got lost.
the only thing I changed on here, it should be enabled by default. But that's, if you scroll down, oh, there's so many options in here.
Wait, I'll just collapse. Where do I go?
Okay, so we have our directional light open. And it's just right here.
Cast shadows.
Cast shadows, these should all be enabled by default. These are default settings.
Oh, sorry.
But under advanced,
Oh, wait, advance.
there's a lot of settings related to how Unreal Engine can cast shadows from this light.
Oh.
But the one I want to sort of highlight to everybody at the moment is cast volumetric shadow. That's so that it will cast shadows on the fog. And the other one that I wanted to mention was transmission. It's not useful right now, but this is the option that you need to enable for a light to cast like subsurface scatter. So anything that's sort of semi-translucent, thinking about skin or like, I don't know, my go-to is Jello, or anything that's sort of like jelly. Anything where light can penetrate a surface, scatter around inside of the surface, but then also still continue out of that surface. Thinking about like our ears, something that's like a thin, fleshy surface. The light enters, it picks up the color of the flesh, and then it passes through. We need to enable transmissions for light to have that rendering feature enabled, because in Unreal it's a screen-based effect. So we need to enable it for light. Right now, not super useful, I mean, unless you're making subsurface materials at the moment, you're not really gonna see any difference. But cast volumetric shadows should be enabled on your directional light. It will be enabled by default. If you add in, like, let's take a look really quickly at rectangle lights. Rectangle lights, spotlights, point lights, they all work very similarly. It's just a difference in shape and some of the settings that you have with them. But generally speaking, once you have,
Still need to learn.
let me just drop my exposure down a little bit.
Too much.
Again, I'm probably gonna have to set this rectangle light to a value that's pretty intense so that we can see it against the daylight that's currently happening. So you will have to probably crank this past the max on the candelas here, probably like, 9,500 candelas, just to see it against daylight, because again, we're talking about small light. But with rectangle lights here, we've got barn door angle, as well as the length of those barn doors. So if you want to direct your light, we'll be covering this next semester when we're talking about character lighting. Your homework 3 is, for next semester, is similar to the moods from this scene, or from from this semester, but you're gonna have your unwrapped head, textured head, and then I'm gonna ask you to get film stills and light your character in relation to those film stills or recreating those film stills. So we'll cover basic lighting a little bit more next semester, but taking a look at, this rectangle light, source width, you can see it changes the fall off of the shadow here. But by default, cast volumetric shadow on spawned lights that aren't the directional light are off by default, so you need to turn this on here. So that's why I'm mentioning it now. Cast volumetric shadow, we need to enable it on. It will be enabled on your directional light. It won't be enabled on specific light actors, like the rectangle light, point light, and the spotlight. So keep that in mind. Again, if it ever happens that your directional light doesn't have it enabled, you can go in and check to see if it is on. But that's pretty much it for today. Appreciate all of you coming up and sitting through another 3-hour lecture of settings and windows and stuff. But yes, I will be trying to get those videos recorded this week so that you guys can have them, watch them over at your own pace.
Thank you.
Thanks.